CollabTalk is a copyright of Collaborative ABA Services, making a difference in children's lives.
Hi everyone, welcome to another series of CollabTalk by Collaborative ABA Services that provides information and resources about autism and everything in between. I am Alicia, the founder of Collaborative ABA Services, and I'm here again with some of our amazing team members.
My name's Katie, I'm an occupational therapist.
I'm Bree, I'm a BCBA.
I'm Meg, I'm a licensed social worker and registered behavior technician.
So, hello everyone. Today we're talking about autism and parenting. In our previous episode, we kind of discussed how autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects language communication, social interactions, and behaviors. And we know that parenting a child with autism can be both a challenging but also rewarding experience. And as we know, autism is a spectrum disorder, and so meaning that every child has unique needs. And with parenting, with a child on the spectrum, parents want to be flexible and also individualize their strategies for each child. So we want to make a disclaimer to please note that this episode is not intended to critique or endorse any specific providers. Our goal is to simply educate and empower the community by providing information and resources to support parenting children on the autism spectrum. So team, let's dive into this. And we're talking about autism and parenting. What are some key considerations that parents should consider when they're parenting? I know like early identification and intervention is one thing. Do you guys want to kind of expand on that?
You know, looking for some of those early signs. Typically when they are younger, you get a questionnaire at your pediatrician during their well visit to kind of help with that. But furthermore, you could always be looking for other signs as well. Like if you have concerns, always bringing it up to your pediatrician or seeking out like a birth to 3 yourself by just going directly to them.
And I think like being comfortable asking questions and like
Right.
I always say like the evaluation or looking into it, it's always worth it, right? Like
Right.
if it ends in resulting in services, that's fabulous. If it doesn't, that's okay too.
Right.
But like you don't know until you kind of like ask those questions.
Right. And I always suggest parents to err on the side of caution. Like, if you have any concerns, just get the evaluation. It's not gonna, like you said, it's not gonna hurt. If anything, it's just gonna benefit them if they do need the services, because the sooner the better.
Yep.
And I think too, like when you talk about early signs, I think, you know, we talked about in our previous episodes about signs and symptoms of autism. And some of those early signs which we talked about is like if your child has delays in speech, if you're noticing, you know, that there's a lack of eye contact, or you're noticing that there's a lack of interest in social interactions with other kiddos, you know, those are some of the things to kind of say. Or even they might have, you might notice that they don't really play with toys or know how to play with toys. So there's some difficulties with play, like they might line up their toys in a row as opposed to actually engaging in pretend play. So those might be some telltale signs to say, hey, I think I need to go talk to my pediatrician.
Another thing I think to keep in mind is some of those, you know, signs are often can be displayed by a typically developing child as well. So I think it's hard as well if you do have some concerns and maybe you share them with your partner or a family and they're like, no, that's fine. But I always say, like, trust your gut. Like, if you think that there might be something, why not get them evaluated? But also allow the professional to make that determination, right? Like, it's not up to the parent to determine if something may be happening or not. It's really up to the professional. So even if it may look like the child is doing something that's a typically developing pure behavior, always just err on the side of caution.
Yeah, and like what Alicia said, it's a spectrum, so it's a developmental disorder. There's a bunch of different ways that it can present, and so a lot of the times I'll have families say like, oh, well, they make really good eye contact, or although they're very social, they like to play with other kids.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that it's not just one thing. It's
Right.
not like, okay, your child doesn't make eye contact, no, boom, autism.
Right.
It's got a lot more to do with it. So like you said, if you have a certain concerns, it's valid to kind of look for more and see if there's anything connected.
Yeah, I think on the other side of it too, if there is hesitation, you're like, oh, I don't see that, but specialists are seeing it, still important to take advantage of those services for early intervention, because I like to think about it like I'm an overpacker for vacation, better be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
To have more kind of wraparound services just in case, even if you think, oh, okay, I'm not seeing that, or if these behaviors or signs, you know, kind of disappear or fade.
So another key consideration for parents, you want to look at your child's communication style. As you know, children on the spectrum, they might use a different variety of ways to communicate, whether that be gestures, pictures, or they might have like what we call assistive technology device to help with communication. What do you guys think about that in regards to communication styles?
I think it's important to be aware that communication is a big, kind of identification of wants and needs. And so seeing that I've had a lot of kids I work with who will have big meltdowns or tantrums based on communication. Like, I have something to share with you, but I don't know how to get it across, or I'm upset, but I can't tell you why. And so I think being able to develop a form of communication with your child, whether it's an AAC device, which is those tablets, that kids can use, or if it's visuals or pictures or gestures, just so that your child has that communication style, it's really important. Because I would say, imagine if you couldn't communicate your wants and needs to other people. It's very frustrating.
Right. And in those earlier years, a lot of the maladaptive behaviors that we see are often used as a form of communication. And so I think it's also important that maybe your child is not using spoken words, however, using signs or gestures is another alternative form of communication that's completely fine. Although I know a lot of families often think like, oh, if they're signing, they're not going to use verbal spoken words. And there's many studies that a speech pathologist can tell you that is actually inaccurate. Like, your child will still learn to, to use spoken words. But I think it's important to use whatever is effective for the child, because without doing so, you might see some of those behaviors become more prominent, because that is their only way to functionally communicate.
And also, too, with communication, a lot of children on the spectrum, and even kids that don't have autism, visual supports and consistent routines are huge for all children, to be honest with you. And, I think as a parent, when you are communicating with your children, you may find that visual supports, like a visual schedule, so that they know, like, the routine or what's expected of them, can be very helpful. How about, and I know you talked about, Bree, about behavior as a form of communication, right? Because a lot of children use behavior to communicate their wants or needs. In regards to that, what are some things that you can kind of encourage parents in regards to, like, behavior and communication in parenting?
So in regards to, like, if the behavior maybe happens and that behavior is to say, maybe the child comes over and, what's an example?
Help opening something.
Right. And so they throw you the bag of chips, right? They throw it at you. And in that instance, like, your child is saying, like, open it, please. But maybe having your child sign open or sign for help, to use some kind of functional communication to replace that, here's a bag of chips, Mom, and throwing it at you, just to teach them that, like, you can use words, because using signs are words, instead of throwing the bag of chips.
Right.
And sorry.
No, that's okay. I was saying, like, immediately reinforcing, like, you can say help, and as soon as they do it, oh, great, I'll help you. So it's honored in their the want to use that communication, like, remains and it's sustained.
They're super motivated because they want those chips. Right?
And also, when you're looking at behavior, you always want to try to give, what we call behavior-specific praise to the behaviors that you want to see more of an increase, right? So if you're modeling for the child to request help with opening a bag of chips, you're going to be like, oh, good job asking for help, because then that's going to promote the child or encourage the child to more likely use their words or signs or gestures to request in the future. And I think as a parent, sometimes we might get frustrated, and it might be easy for us to give that feedback, like, hey, no, don't do this, or no, don't do that. The biggest empowering thing for a child is to use positive or frame things in a positive manner, because, we always say, if instead of saying what you don't want them to do, you want to say what you do want them to do. Because sometimes with kiddos, if you're like, don't do this, don't do that, you might say, no throwing. And in their mind, they might hear throwing. Oh, she said I can throw. As opposed to, oh, great job asking for, help. So they remember, that part. So I think that's a big thing, too, is just using those or framing what we want the child to do in a positive manner.
Right.
Yeah, I was thinking, too, like, on the flip side of the coin, like, not over prompting communication during those behaviors. Because I mean, take perspective. If you're mad, you want somebody to say, "Tell me how you feel."
Yeah.
What do you want? Over and over. Calm
God.
body.
Yeah.
You know, so
Stop yelling.
right. And like as an alternative, you know, teach if it's like on an AAC or pictures or just walking away, like saying like I need space. And then, you know, I feel like they'll reapproach when they're ready to ask again, or you could, then you have a teachable moment to show how to communicate that effectively and appropriately.
And I think with behaviors too, kind of recognizing that just because your child has autism doesn't mean that you have to have those behaviors. Like it doesn't have to be like that. So I had a lot of families that come in or start the journey on autism and their child has some really non-functional things that are really disruptive to the family routines or are very stressful for the parents, saying, oh, my child, you know, is self-injurious, and it's very upsetting for them. And they kind of think that, well, because my child has autism, this is kind of what it is. And, you know, you have to take a different approach for every kid, but it doesn't always have to be, this is just what it is. We can help work on it. We might need a different approach versus a neurotypical child, but that doesn't mean that you just have to have this be this way. There are ways to address it. It might just be a different approach or a different avenue.
Another thing to consider as a parent of a child on the spectrum is also the child's sensory needs, right? And I'm gonna like look over to you, Katie, as a licensed therapist, because that's all you.
I think the biggest thing I've seen that's kind of like an indicator, we talked about, you know, early signs or differences between a child that has autism or a child that just has sensory needs is kind of like meltdown versus tantrum. So if you have a younger child, they might have a tantrum like, oh, I wanted this, you know, you see those pictures on the internet, like, you know, a kid, you know, laying on like the aisle of Target and it's like, my child is mad that their mittens are blue. Like, you know, that's a tantrum. That's a typical young kid thing that they're having a tough time. Versus, you know, you could see that same picture and maybe a child with autism is, you know, a string came out of the mitten and now I can't put the mitten back on. So I think that those meltdowns over things that are sensory based, whether things feel, the way things sound, the way things look, the way things taste, tend to be bigger and more intense for children with autism. So I think being aware that you may have to modify some certain things or being aware of some of those sensory needs, they feel things more intensely than other children do.
Right. And sometimes that inability to like self-soothe and cope and strategize. I was thinking too about the sensory, you know, if you're noticing like your child every time you go into a loud place, like engaging in SIB and hitting themselves in the head, maybe trying headphones or something to help them kind of cope with the environment, even if it's not preferred or is a little triggering for them as far as sensory.
Yeah, because there's modifications you can make to a lot of things, and I think that sensory needs started off being kind of more prevalent in, you know, the divergent community, but I think now if you go onto like any website or go anywhere, there's weighted blankets for adults, there's those snuggly like, you know, koozies you can like sleep in. So I think that everybody's starting to recognize that we all have sensory needs and it's all really beneficial. So I think that being okay, knowing, okay, my child needs to do something different to be able to enjoy this community outing. I've seen kids go to, I think it's like Monster Jam for like the monster trucks, and they have the big headphones, but they're loving it. So I think being okay with, I can take a different path, but I can still do this thing that my kids like.
Right. And you guys, we all raised some like very good points. So the next area we want to talk about is like, what are some of those parenting strategies that like parents that are watching this episode can take with them? I know the first thing is really, you know, creating structure. Like structure is very huge. You do want to establish, you know, those clear routines, especially predictable transitions, because a lot of the kiddos may struggle with, you know, transitions. That seems to be like a common concern. And if we set them up for success by providing that structure in advance, they kind of know what to expect beforehand. And that's where kind of like we were talking earlier about like the visuals. So like having like a visual schedule, or like my favorite to go to is a timer. So they kind of know like, okay, when the timer goes off, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. You know, because it's like we want to set them up for success.
Yeah, and I think understanding that depending on the age of the child, the concept of time, knowing like what 5 minutes actually feels like, I think is hard. So using timers is a great way to take a kind of open-ended concept and make it very concrete.
Right. Also, some of those kiddos that like have challenging when like maybe a parent is placing a demand, but when the timer goes off, it kind of changes that like demand. Like, oh, the timer's the timer's telling you it's all done. It kind of just changes the perspective for the kid or the child.
I think warnings too, like if things are different, like in my experience with using visual schedules have been really successful, and especially when something different is happening.
Yes.
Okay, when I get off the bus, I'm going in the house, taking off my shoes, but oh no, we have an appointment, you're getting in the car.
Right.
So kind of teaching that even before school, letting the school know something's going to be different. Can you remind
Right.
so and so that when he gets home, we're not going in the house, we're going in the car.
Yeah.
To kind of mitigate those and proactively, try to prevent those meltdowns
Yeah.
or maladaptive behaviors. Yeah.
I think clear expectations across the board, like you had mentioned, but like all together. And I think it's important that maybe with a neurotypical kid, those expectations can be a little bit looser, right? But with some of our friends on the spectrum, it's a little bit harder to have that wiggle room. Like you almost have to be a little bit more concrete to like keep that expectation in place to then get them to follow through with what your expectations are.
Create
Whether it be-
rigidity in yourself.
Yeah.
a little bit. Like
While
whether it
teaching
be, like,
flexibility.
we eat at the table, right? Or whatever it may be.
And with the visuals too, I was thinking like using pictures of real life things like your kitchen table, your
Yes.
doctor's office, your car, instead of the classic Prolo Quo touch
Yeah,
chat
right.
icons, because a picture of a red car and you have a blue truck,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah, right. They may not be
together?
making
Yeah.
that connection.
Right.
Right. Another strategy, we also want parents. So I know we talked about like creating structure,
Yeah.
but we also should need to allow some flexibility too and kind of meet them where they are. And if
Yes.
someone, there was like a famous quote, it was like, if they can't learn the way that we teach, then we have to teach the way that they learn.
Yes.
And with that, we have to be open to modifying our environment. And sometimes we might have to also modify our approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And that could mean, instead of verbally telling them to do something, we give them a visual.
Yeah. I think too, being aware, being comfortable with the fact that everybody's on their own journey. Everybody's kind of doing things differently. I know one of the biggest things that comes up in early intervention is those developmental milestones. Like, oh, my child isn't doing this or my child isn't doing that, and kind of like looking for success for certain, areas of skill by like seeing if they've reached those milestones.
Yeah.
And I think that for most children, they will reach them at some point. It just might take a different approach for different kids depending on where they're at. So being okay with like, okay, my child hasn't reached this at this point, but that's okay. Like, we're
Right,
working
right.
towards it.
Right.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because another strategy to kind of consider is like kind of piggyback what you just said is we want to foster that independence, right? And that could mean we're breaking, larger tasks into smaller steps, or what we call chaining, right? Or task analysis, right? And also it's important that we celebrate the small wins. We might not, they might not achieve a goal in a short duration of time, but every progress should be a small win.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of like that saying, the forest through the trees, right? Like, if you're thinking of something bigger, more long term, you might be missing some of those smaller, really kind of awesome things that are tricky to see.
Right. And also, like, some of our friends might have really big feelings to very small situations, right?
Yeah.
Which leads me to the next strategy of building emotional regulation, right? And supporting them with those coping skills. And it's kind of like they might be having big feelings, but they just can't tell you how they're feeling.
Right.
And, again, that's kind of part of the diagnosis, is they do have issues with social communication skills. And that might, play a role in like issues with peers and those social skills, right? And the emotional regulation. So I think, just kind of helping to support them and teaching them, how to, self-regulate. And it's okay if you have big feelings, and, working with them on those coping strategies is huge.
Yeah, and I think too, like for parents, it's important to think about those things and not participating in desired things like, we can't go to the amusement park because your brother gets too hot.
Right.
Instead, saying, let me look into it. Do they have cooling stations? Is there somewhere he can go if he needs to cool down
Right.
without, and everybody can still enjoy their time? And planning trips, like travel is hard, but if like
Yeah.
planning ahead and being proactive and having alternatives and teaching those alternatives to help strategies for coping.
Right. And I think too, another area to kind of discuss too is self-care. And I feel like as a parent, you have to be kind to yourself.
Yes.
It is okay. Sometimes as a parent, we might need our own time out.
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
okay, just to, regulate our own emotions.
Right.
So I think, just being kind to yourself and just giving yourself grace
Right.
is huge. And, and that kind of goes with taking time for yourself, self-care is very huge. And, please don't feel guilty if you're like, okay, I need to be away from my children, even if it's 5 minutes. You need that time to regroup and refill your cup so that you can be helpful to someone else.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I think you're right. Like, I feel like a big kind of issue with, as an autism mom, is feeling that guilt, like, they need me. I don't have 5 minutes to myself, but like seeking like support groups and things like that where you feel like safe to kind of complain in a way or talk about struggles, talk about things that are hard. It's hard, and it's okay to say it out loud.
Right.
And if that's like, if you need to find a place to do that, then I would really suggest that for some parents. Yeah, and it's helpful.
Because parenting in general for any child is tough.
Right.
It's difficult to be a parent in general. So I think that understanding that a child with autism might be a little bit more challenging in certain ways. So I think being, like you said, being okay with saying this is really hard or this is really tough or maybe this is trickier or not what I expected it to be is important to kind of like do that. It's like those oxygen masks. You have to put it on for yourself before you can help somebody else.
Yeah, and meeting other parents is like the best resource.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you went through that too.
Right.
I'm not just
you did
me.
that.
Also, and like kind of tips and tricks for each other.
So
this worked for
validating.
my child. Could it work for yours? It's worth a shot, and just kind of sharing those experiences and tips.
And hearing how it is hard, right? And being able to say it, almost like you're like, it feels good to get it out and to talk to somebody else and hear that it isn't just you. Because I do think sometimes maybe you look within like, it's hard for me. Maybe it's because I'm not doing the right things or the right steps or not always implementing ABA or whatever it may be the perfect way. So I think it's giving yourself some grace.
Right, and that thought, like, nobody understands.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what this is like. So meeting those other parents, meeting those other caregivers and other professionals that work in it and have children in it and things like that, it's really helpful to kind of have those shoulders to lean on.
Yeah, and I think just piggyback what you guys are saying, it sounds like another strategy is to kind of build that support system, right? From what I'm hearing, especially you were saying like with the support groups.
Yeah.
I think that is huge. Feeling like you're not alone is huge. Another thing to consider is also, as a parent with a child with special needs, is also educating yourself on navigating, those other outside supports such as the school system, right? Finding out like your rights under, IEPs or special education law or what they call 504 plans as well. Finding out if your child does qualify for those services because collaborating, we talked about this in our other episodes about the importance of collaborating, with the interdisciplinary team. So just kind of increasing awareness of those other resources and supports your child can receive across settings, not just in home or community, but also collaborating, with teachers, but also therapists or other providers are huge.
Checking in with the procedural safeguards notice. You can request it from the school. You can look it up online. It has a lot of really good information about rights and education laws.
Right. So those are just some things to kind of consider. Is there anything else that you feel like, to kind of, or some key takeaways or any other key points that, a parent could be helpful for a parent that is listening to our episode today?
I think one of the things we were talking about with like the support system and kind of finding that thing is that there is something concrete called respite care. Like it's a very specific thing that you can get support through your state. I mean, every state is different, but a lot of times families will mention that they don't feel comfortable taking that time for self-care or taking that support because like I don't have somebody that knows my child or somebody that could work with them or do that. And so respite care, depending on the state, is support from an individual who is trained who can do that, who can help you with your child, who understands what you're going through, and it can be a safe person for you to be able to take that time to yourself when that person's working with your child.
And there's a lot more out there now that are kind of in tune to your child's actual needs. So if your child has a specific behavior plan or working on specific skills that you are implementing at home, typically they are also carrying over those same plans, which is really nice. Gives you a little bit of ease of mind.
Yeah, I agree. Social media is a great place to find those kind of parent groups and community groups that kind of lean on each other for those resources and have had experience with respite or people who do it independently, kind of contracted and work for companies, not promoting, but similar to like a care.com, something like that, but it's specifically for special needs. So there's the background checks and all the things to make you feel a little more secure and safe.
Thanks, everyone. I think today was a very informative episode about autism and parenting. You know, it is a big general topic, but I think we covered a lot of ground today. I want to say, thanks everyone for tuning in to this episode of CollabTalk. If you find it valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss another episode. Got thoughts or questions? Drop them in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep this conversation going. To learn more about Collaborative ABA Services, check us out on our website at collaborativeabaservices.com and also our additional social media pages on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and
TikTok.
Oh yeah, TikTok. Thank you. Bye.
CollabTalk is a copyright of Collaborative ABA Services, making a difference in children's lives.